Her presence would not be required. That was the whole of what the Duke of Marchbrook said, standing in the doorway with the morning's post still in his glove, and he said it the way a man remarks on the weather, without once looking at the woman he was speaking about. Eleanor Fairbourne sat at the long table in the morning room, with the household's visiting book open before her, a quill in one hand and 3 days of correspondence sorted into neat stacks by urgency, the way she sorted everything in this house that no one else troubled to notice needed sorting. Outside the window, a gardener was cutting the last of the early roses for the hall vases, and somewhere above them a housemaid was beating dust out of a curtain nobody would remember to compliment. Marchbrook Hall moved through its mornings the way a well-wound clock moves through its hours, each small gear turning because Eleanor had, at some point in the last 2 years, oiled it herself. Eleanor kept her eyes on the page a moment longer. She finished the line she was writing, blotted it, and only then set the quill down. Not required for the welcome, your grace, or not required at all. Philip Haverstock, 5th Duke of Marchbrook, had the grace to hesitate before he answered, which was, his aunt would have said, more grace than he managed most mornings before breakfast. He set the letters down on the sideboard, unopened, as though delaying that small task might delay the larger one waiting behind it.
The welcome this afternoon? Mrs. Pruitt will see the Ashworths settled. I would rather you finish the correspondence.
It was a small dismissal, small enough that a stranger watching would have called it nothing at all. Eleanor had learned in 2 years under this roof that the small ones were the ones worth watching, the way a groom learns to watch a horse's ears before its hooves. She picked the quill back up. As you wish, your grace. He lingered a moment longer than the errand required, as though there were a second sentence waiting behind the first one, and he had decided at the last not to spend it. Then he was gone down the passage, and the house settled back into the particular quiet that follows a duke leaving a room he does not know he has disturbed. Nobody in Hampshire believed Marchbrook Hall ran itself. They never once asked who ran it, which amounted to the same mistake, and would cost the house rather more, before the fortnight was out, than anyone at that breakfast table yet understood. For 2 years, the answer to that unasked question had been Eleanor, and the proof of it sat in the leather-bound visiting book she kept at her left hand from 6 in the morning until whichever candle burned down last. She knew which dowagers required a personal note and which would take offense at one. She knew that Lady Pemberton's cook set the second Tuesday aside for jam-making, and would not receive callers that afternoon under any provocation, and that old Colonel Whitmore still grieved a son lost at Corunna and should never be seated facing the door, where the draught from the hall made him think of open country. She had learned that last fact the hard way in her first month at Marchbrook, watching the old soldier's hand tighten around his wineglass until the stem nearly cracked, his eyes fixed on the draft-stirred curtain as though it were smoke on a foreign field. She had moved his place setting herself before the next dinner without asking leave, and never mentioned why. He had never known to thank her for it. That, she had decided early, was rather the point. None of it was written anywhere but in her own hand on pages she alone consulted, because Lady Augusta Haverstock, whom Eleanor had been engaged 2 years ago to attend as companion, had long since handed the running of the house sideways to the one person in it with a memory for such things and the patience to use it. You could keep the book yourself, my lady. It is only ink and attention. Augusta had laughed at that not unkindly and said she had neither the hand for the ink nor the temperament for the attention, and counted herself fortunate to have Eleanor for both. She meant it as a compliment, and it was one, and Eleanor had never quite found the words to explain why a sensible arrangement and a valued one were not always the same thing. Philip, for his part, called the arrangement convenient when he troubled to name it at all. Neither of them called it, in Eleanor's hearing, anything that resembled thanks. He had, once, come close. It was February, past midnight, and she had still been at the table finishing the funeral correspondence after his uncle's death, her fingers stiff with cold because she would not ring for more coal so late. He had come down for a book he did not truly want and found her there instead.
You should be asleep.
So should you, your grace.
I find sleep difficult the week we bury someone.
So do I, though I have had rather less practice burying dukes.
It was, for him, almost a smile. He had crossed the room without another word, built the fire back up himself, badly, singeing one cuff in the process, and left before she could thank him for it. In the morning, neither of them mentioned it. She had kept the burned cuff link he left behind on the mantel afterward, not from sentiment, she told herself, but because a duke ought not to lose his belongings in his own house. That was the shape of 2 years, warmth offered sideways, accepted sideways, never once looked at head-on. Eleanor had told herself it was enough, the way a woman tells herself a great many things are enough when the alternative is admitting what she actually wants. The Ashworths' visit was meant to end that arrangement, though not in any way that concerned Eleanor. Lord Reginald Ashworth was bringing his wife and his daughter Cordelia to Marchbrook for a fortnight, and everyone above the age of 12 in that house understood the fortnight was a courtship, undertaken with the particular efficiency of families who had already agreed on terms and required only the young people's cooperation to finish the business. Augusta had been managing Philip's marriage prospects with the patient relentlessness of a woman laying siege to a fortress, and Lord Ashworth's daughter was, by every measure Augusta cared to name, the correct match. Old family, untroubled reputation. A father with influence enough in the Lords to matter to a young duke still finding his footing there. Augusta had said more than once that week that Miss Ashworth was accomplished at the pianoforte and free of any scandal attached to her name, and that Philip could do a great deal worse. He had heard the observation often enough by Thursday to answer it without looking up from his correspondence.
I am aware, Aunt. I have read the letter as many times as you have quoted it to me.
Philip had agreed to the visit without argument, which Eleanor understood better than Augusta did, because Eleanor was the one who had watched him read Lord Ashworth's letter of acceptance 3 times before setting it down, and watched his hand stay flat on the table afterward, as though he were holding something still. She had not asked him why. 2 years had taught her that some silences in that house were hers to notice and not hers to disturb. The Ashworths arrived on a Thursday in a travel-worn carriage that Mrs. Pruitt received with entire competence, as promised. And by Thursday evening the household sat down to its first formal dinner of the fortnight with candles lit the length of the table and Augusta presiding at one end, like a woman who had waited months for this exact arrangement of chairs. Eleanor had helped choose the menu 2 days before, had written the place cards in her own careful hand, had moved Colonel Whitmore's setting away from the draft without anyone asking why, and had gone, as always, unmentioned in the credit for any of it. Eleanor took no place among the guests that evening. She had eaten early, alone, in the small parlor off the kitchen passage, and come after to the morning room to finish the week's letters while the house was occupied elsewhere, the murmur of the dinner reaching her thin and muffled through 2 closed doors. It was Augusta who fetched her, flustered and pink at the temples because Lady Ashworth had asked, with perfect courtesy and no malice whatsoever, whether the young woman who managed the correspondence might not join them for coffee. Having heard from a mutual acquaintance that Marchbrook's hospitality was famously well run and wishing to compliment whoever deserved the credit. Augusta caught her breath in the doorway and said only that Lady Ashworth had asked for her particularly, and that it would be rude to refuse. Eleanor set down her pen, smoothed her skirt, and allowed herself, for the length of the walk down the passage, a small and foolish hope that this might be the evening 2 years of sideways courtesy finally turned to face her at all. Philip answered before she reached the door. She heard him from the passage, his voice pitched to carry the length of the dining room without seeming to try, the particular carrying calm of a man who has decided in the space of one breath what the correct thing to say is, and has not troubled to ask himself whether it is also the kind one. Miss Fairbourne's presence would not be required this evening, he said. She had correspondence enough to occupy her, and Lady Ashworth's own generous attention to the table had left nothing wanting. It was said lightly, almost as a courtesy in return, the sort of remark a host makes to spare a servant the trouble of standing about being admired. Eleanor stood in the passage with her hand still on the door and understood, in the space of that one sentence, what she was in this house, stated aloud for the first time in 2 years, in front of the one family whose good opinion mattered enough for Philip to bother stating it at all. Lady Ashworth murmured something gracious and let the matter drop, the way one lets drop any small mystery that is plainly none of one's affair. Cordelia Ashworth, who had done nothing to deserve any part of this, glanced toward the passage with an expression that might have been pity and might only have been curiosity, and looked away again quickly, the way well-bred young women learn to look away from things they are not meant to have seen. Augusta's face did something complicated and unhappy. She opened her mouth as though to correct him, to say that Eleanor was a great deal more than correspondence, that the very menu on the table had been her doing down to the last course, and then closed it again, because a correction offered in front of guests would only have made the wound more visible, not less. Eleanor stepped back into the shadow of the passage before anyone could turn and find her there listening. She did not cry. She had expected, standing in that passage, that she might, and was almost curious, in a distant way, to find that what came instead was something colder and far more useful. She walked back to the morning room, sat down at the table where the visiting book still lay open, and read the last line she had written before she left it. Lady Pemberton's second Tuesday jam-making, do not call before 3. She looked at that sentence for a long moment, a small true fact about a woman's kitchen that no one but Eleanor troubled to remember, the kind of fact that held a whole household's dignity together without ever once being noticed for it, and closed the book.
Very well, Your Grace. Not required.
She said it to an empty room. It was the only time that night she allowed herself the satisfaction of the last word, and no one heard it but the visiting book and the cold hearth. She sat with her hands flat on the closed cover for a long while after, listening to laughter reach her faintly from the dining room, and did not open it again. Twice, in the hour that followed, her hand drifted toward the book out of nothing but habit, the way a hand reaches for a familiar tool before the mind has finished deciding whether the task still belongs to it. Both times she caught herself, and folded her hands instead in her lap and sat with the particular discomfort of a woman relearning, after 2 years, what her own 2 hands were for when no one required them for anything at all. If you are listening right now, tell us in the comments, is it warm where you are, or cold enough that a room like that one would feel it too? Eleanor did not resign. Augusta received no letter of grievance, no announcement of a packed trunk, nothing so satisfying as a proper leaving. From that evening forward, she stopped. The visiting book closed and stayed closed. The 3 stacks of correspondence, sorted by urgency, sat where she had left them, growing a 4th stack and then a 5th, because she answered only what was addressed to her by name, and very little was. Since for 2 years everything in that house that required tact had been quietly routed to her without ever bearing her name. The first casualty was small. Lady Pemberton's note of condolence, 2 weeks overdue, went unwritten, and the old woman took the silence as Eleanor had always known she would, as an insult requiring a return insult, delivered at the next assembly in the form of a very audible remark about households that had forgotten their manners along with their staff. Philip heard of it secondhand, blamed a clerical oversight, and never thought to ask who had always prevented such oversights before. A man rarely notices the absence of something he never once watched being done. The second casualty had a face to it. Colonel Whitmore came to dine that same week, and the footman, working from no instruction but habit gone suddenly unreliable, seated him facing the hall door, where the evening draught stirred the curtain the way it always had, the way it had not been permitted to for 2 years. The old soldier's hand found his wine-glass and did not lift it. He excused himself before the second course, citing a chill, and no one at the table understood why a man who had survived a Spanish winter should be troubled by an English one, because no one but Eleanor had ever known the true reason, and Eleanor was not there to move his chair. The third casualty was larger still. 2 calls meant for the same Tuesday afternoon arrived within the hour of each other, a collision that would never have happened under Eleanor's careful staggering of the household's social calendar. And Augusta spent 40 uncomfortable minutes making conversation with a clergyman's wife and a countess who despised each other and had been kept, for a full social season, from ever learning the fact. Augusta came to Eleanor's room that night, knocked, and was refused entry with perfect courtesy through a closed door.
I have a headache, my lady, forgive me.
It was not, strictly, a lie. 2 years of holding a house together with nothing but memory and tact will give a woman a headache eventually, and Eleanor had chosen for the first time to let it be someone else's problem to manage. Philip attempted the following morning to write 3 thank-you notes himself, having found the growing stack of unanswered correspondence on the morning room table, and decided, with the particular confidence of a man who has never once done a thing, that it could not be so very difficult. He spent an hour on the first, addressed to a dowager he had met twice in his life, and produced a letter so stiff with formality that Augusta, reading it over his shoulder, asked gently whether he meant to propose marriage to the woman or merely thank her for a fruit basket. He burned the letter in the grate and did not attempt a second. It was, in its small way, the first time he had understood, not been told, but understood in his own clumsy hand how much skill lived inside work he had spent 2 years mistaking for simplicity. Eleanor herself, in the quiet of Augusta's dour cottage, spent one whole evening with a sheet of paper and a half-written letter of application to a family in Bath said to be looking for a governess. She got as far as her own name before she set the pen down, unable to decide whether she stopped because leaving would solve nothing, or because some stubborn part of her still hoped it would not come to that. She burned the letter in the small grate, the same as Philip had burned his, though neither of them would learn that fact until long afterward, and told herself it was only sensible not to act in anger. Philip came a week later, past midnight again, the same hour as the February fire, and found the morning room dark and the visiting book gathering dust under a stack of unopened letters. He stood in the doorway a long moment before he went looking for her elsewhere in the house. He found her in the library instead, reading by a single candle, and something in the set of her shoulders when she heard the door made him stop rather than approach.
The house is falling apart without you. I don't imagine that surprises you.
No, Your Grace, it doesn't.
Augusta thinks I've offended you.
Augusta is a perceptive woman.
He crossed the room then, the way he had crossed it in February, and stopped an arm's length from her chair, close enough that she could see he had not slept well in several nights, though she found she could not presently spare him her sympathy for it.
I only meant that you had enough to occupy you. I never meant.
You meant exactly what you said. Your Grace. You said it plainly, and you said it to Lord and Lady Ashworth, so that they would understand it too. I am not required. I have understood that for some time. I only did not know you had understood it so precisely until you said it aloud.
Colonel Whitmore took ill at dinner this week, left before the second course.
Did he?
You know why? I could see it in your face just now, that you know why, and you're not going to tell me.
No, Your Grace. I am not.
It was the closest she came, that night, to cruelty, and she felt the shape of it in her own chest afterward, sharp and not comfortable at all, the way a person feels the first time they discover they are capable of withholding something on purpose.
What would satisfy you, tell me, and I will do it.
I do not want to be satisfied, Your Grace. I want to have been seen 2 years ago, and no amount of asking now can make you owe me that debt after the fact.
He had no answer for that, or none he was willing to give her that night, and after a silence that went on longer than either of them meant it to, he left the way he had come, without the book he had claimed to want. What he did instead, 2 mornings later, surprised even Augusta. Rather than seek Eleanor out again, he asked Lady Ashworth herself, with the particular stiff formality of a man convincing himself he has made no error at all, whether she would be so kind as to assist with the remaining arrangements for the fortnight, since his aunt's usual help had taken unwell. Lady Ashworth agreed with every appearance of pleasure, and set about reorganizing a household social calendar with the confidence of a woman who did not yet know that Lady Pemberton required 3 days' notice for anything, that the vicar's wife and the Countess of Roebray had not spoken since a disputed hymnal in 1809, or that Colonel Whitmore should never, under any circumstance, be seated facing the door. By the second evening of her stewardship, Lady Ashworth had seated the vicar's wife and the Countess of Roebray at the same small card table, in perfect good faith, and spent a baffled quarter hour wondering why two such accomplished women had so little to say to one another. Augusta sat 2 chairs away, wine untouched, watching a piece 2 years in the keeping come apart over a hand of whist, and understood for the first time how much labor had gone unnoticed in her own house. Augusta watched all of this with the particular helplessness of a woman who could see a wall coming and no longer had the authority to stop the carriage. She told Eleanor the rest of it 3 days later, in fragments, over tea neither of them drank. Reginald Ashworth's father, the old baron, had once been the loudest voice at a ball in London, the year Philip's father meant to marry a solicitor's daughter named Sophia Vane instead of the suitable bride his own family had chosen for him. The old baron had made a public joke of it, loud enough for half the room, about dukes who married beneath a governess and daughters who married beneath a duke, and Philip's father had broken the engagement inside a fortnight and married as his family wished instead, and spent the rest of his life, by his sister's account, looking like a man who had set something down and never quite found where he left it. Augusta remembered Sophia Vane only once, glimpsed at a distance outside a milliner's shop years after the engagement ended. A solicitor's daughter with an ordinary bonnet and an unremarkable face that had, Augusta said, nothing whatsoever to recommend it, except that her brother's whole countenance had changed at the sight of her. For as long as it took him to remember, he was no longer permitted to cross the street and speak to her. Philip had been 11 years old the winter his father died, still married to the correct wife and still, in his sister's private opinion, only half present in his own house. He had grown up believing the lesson of that story was that love, held up to the light where people like Reginald Ashworth's father could see it, would always be mocked into the ground. He had never once considered that the lesson might instead have been to stop hiding what mattered before it curdled into regret. Augusta told Eleanor this not to excuse him, she said, but because a woman ought to know what she was up against, and it was not indifference. In the days after, more than one servant reported finding the Duke standing alone in the darkened morning room at odd hours, hands braced on the back of Eleanor's empty chair, doing nothing at all that anyone could name. He never explained himself when caught at it, and no one in that house had yet learned to ask a duke outright what he was looking for in a room with nothing left in it to find.
Carriage.
The disaster, when it came,
Bring the
arrived
carriage
through the
now.
post, which was
Directly.
fitting, since the post had been Eleanor's province, and no one else's for 2 years. Lady Ashworth, working from a guest list she did not understand, had sent the formal dinner invitation for the fortnight's final evening to Lord Ashworth under the style his late father had held. An old title the family had stopped using the year the son inherited a debt alongside the barony. A debt the son had spent a decade repaying and did not care to be reminded of in ink, in his own name, delivered by his own host. Eleanor would have caught the error in a glance, exactly the kind of small cruelty a household's memory exists to prevent, and it reached Lord Ashworth's hand on the very morning of the dinner meant to settle his daughter's engagement. Philip learned of it from Augusta, white-faced an hour before the guests were due to gather, and understood at once that Lord Ashworth would read insult in it, deliberate or not, and that a man once humiliated in a London ballroom for loving beneath his station did not forgive careless reminders of debt from a house that ought to have known better. There was one way to mend it before evening, and it required a letter in Eleanor's own hand, since she alone knew the family's history well enough to correct the error without making it worse, and Eleanor was an hour's drive away at Augusta's dower cottage. Having gone there 3 days before to escape a house she no longer troubled to run, Philip called for the carriage himself, would not wait for a groom to be found, and drove the first mile in a rain that had begun as mist and was rapidly becoming something with more opinion about the matter. He had left his hat behind on the hall table and did not notice until the water was already running down the back of his collar. Eleanor answered her own door, startled, dressed for an ordinary evening at home, and did not have time to refuse him before he was inside out of the wet, explaining the disaster in the clipped, urgent sentences of a man who has stopped pretending he is calm.
You could have sent a note. There was no need to come yourself.
A note would have taken the same hour and accomplished considerably less. I needed you to believe me, and a letter is easy to disbelieve.
She studied him a moment in the candlelight of her own small hall, rain still dripping from his sleeve onto the floor. Augusta's housekeeper kept scrupulously clean, and found against every sensible instinct she owned that she believed him already. She agreed to come. Not for him, she told herself, climbing into the carriage with her cloak already damp through, but because Lord Ashworth's daughter had done nothing to deserve an ending like this, and because a household's memory, once built, does not enjoy watching itself be wasted out of spite. She was aware, settling onto the seat opposite him, of how carefully she was choosing that reasoning, and of how little it would survive an honest look. 2 weeks of cold rooms and unanswered letters had not, in the end, cured her of wanting to be needed by this particular man in this particular house. It had only taught her to be more frightened of saying so, in case the wanting turned out, once again, to run in one direction only. 2 weeks was not so very long a time, said aloud, and yet it had been long enough for the cottage garden to go from tight bud to full bloom outside her window, long enough for Augusta to send 4 notes she had not answered, and Philip none at all until this evening. Long enough for Eleanor to learn how loud a small house could be with nothing in it but her own thoughts for company. The carriage lurched onto the Hampshire road with rain coming sideways now, hard enough that the driver slowed to a crawl and the lamps threw more shadow than light. A 1/4 mile from the turn toward Marchbrook, the rear wheel found a rut deep enough to hold it, and the horses strained against harness that would not move the coach another inch. Philip was out into the rain before the driver had finished swearing at the mud, coat already ruined, shoulder braced against the wheel. Eleanor followed without waiting to be asked, skirts gathered in one fist, her gloved hands finding the spokes beside his. It took the 3 of them together. On the count, the driver called out over the storm, to rock the wheel free, and by the time it lurched loose they were both soaked through and laughing, for a moment, at the absurdity of a duke and a companion shoving a carriage out of Hampshire mud, like a pair of farmhands. For the length of one long straight stretch after that, climbing back inside, neither of them said anything at all.
I never told you about my father.
Your aunt did.
He looked at her then, and something in his face suggested he had expected to be the one telling it, and had to rebuild the sentence around the fact that he was not.
Then you understand why I said what I said. Not the reason you deserve to hear, but the actual one.
I understand what frightened you into saying it. That is not the same as understanding why you chose to say it to me, in front of the one family whose opinion could still wound you the way his father's opinion wounded yours.
The carriage swayed hard over a rut, throwing them both against the same side, and for a moment his hand closed over hers on the seat between them before either of them decided whether that was permitted.
I thought if no one saw what you were to this house, no one could take it from you the way it was taken from him. I told myself I was protecting you. I have had 2 weeks in a cold morning room to understand that I was protecting myself and calling it your name instead.
That is the most honest thing you have said to me in 2 years, Your Grace.
What would you have had me do instead? Say your name in front of Reginald Ashworth and hand him the exact weapon that ruined my father.
I would have had you decide, even privately, that the weapon was worth the risk. You never once considered that possibility. You went straight to protecting me from a danger I never asked you to weigh on my behalf.
He said nothing to that for a long moment, and she watched something in him shift, the particular stillness of a man realizing an old argument he had never once questioned might, after all, be wrong.
I'm asking now, is it worth the risk to you?
I have spent 2 weeks alone in a cold cottage finding out that it was never my risk to weigh either. Your Grace. It was always yours to take, and you did not take it. That is what I have understood these 2 weeks better than I understood it before.
She offered him no assurance that it mended anything, because it did not yet, and she had learned too much these 2 weeks about the cost of pretending small kindnesses settled large debts. But she left her hand just where it was, and the rain went on hammering the carriage roof the rest of the way to Marchbrook. They arrived with less than an hour to spare, and Eleanor went straight to the morning room, wet cloak and all, to write the correction in her own hand and seal it with the household's proper style, a note of apology worded with such care, pitched to acknowledge the error without dwelling on it, that Lord Ashworth read it twice at his own door before he agreed to come at all. Cordelia found her on the stairs while the household scrambled to dress for dinner, and stopped, and said nothing for a moment, only looked at Eleanor's damp hem and disordered hair with an expression that was, for the first time in the fortnight, free of any pity at all. The younger woman confessed, low and quick, that she had hoped someone might yet put this evening right, not for her father's sake, or even her own prospects, but because she had watched the Duke these 2 weeks and known, the way young women sometimes know things older people talk themselves out of, that he had been missing someone the whole time no one would say aloud. Eleanor had no answer ready for that, and none was required, because the housekeeper called them both toward the stairs before either could find one. He came, but he came watchful, the particular watchfulness of a man deciding whether an old wound was about to be reopened for sport. And he took his seat at the Marchbrook table with the wary courtesy of someone who has been mocked once in a room like this and does not intend to be mocked twice. Eleanor took her place at the table for the first time that fortnight, seated by Philip's own hand rather than left to find a chair, and the room noticed the arrangement without any of them saying so aloud. Colonel Whitmore, 3 seats down and facing safely away from the door, caught her eye once across the candles and inclined his head in a small private acknowledgement that needed no explanation between them. Dinner went well enough through the soup and the fish, and it was over the second remove that Lord Ashworth, warmed by wine and old grievance both, observed to the table at large that some houses ran on love and some ran on good sense. And a wise man learned early which of the two kept the roof from leaking, a remark aimed close enough to Philip's father's memory that Augusta's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Philip set down his glass without raising his voice, though the whole table felt the change in him the way a room feels weather turning before the first drop falls.
I have some experience of houses run on good sense alone, Lord Ashworth. I grew up in one. My father chose it over the woman he loved on your own father's advice, delivered rather more loudly than advice usually requires, and I watched what good sense cost him for the rest of his life.
The table had gone silent. Cordelia Ashworth, to her credit, looked at her own father with an expression that suggested she had wondered about this story for years and never once heard it told so openly.
This house has run on good sense for 2 years, Lord Ashworth, but not the kind you mean. It is run because one woman remembered which dowager takes offense easily and which colonel cannot bear to face a door, because she answered every letter I never troubled to read and prevented every insult I never noticed coming. I told her 2 weeks ago that her presence wasn't required at this table. I have spent 2 weeks discovering exactly how wrong a man can be.
He turned then and looked straight at Eleanor for what she would later realize was the first time he had done so in front of witnesses in 2 years, without the sideways courtesy of a man protecting something by refusing to name it.
Miss Fairbourne's presence is required at this table, Lord Ashworth, from this evening forward and for as long as she will consent to give it. I would rather lose your good opinion than lose hers a second time.
Lord Ashworth studied him a long moment, the wine going still in his glass, and something in his own face shifted, an old man recognizing, perhaps for the first time, what his father's laughter had cost the boy across a London ballroom 30 years before. When he spoke again, it was to withdraw the remark outright, and to say with visible effort that his father's wit had never been worth what it cost other men to laugh at it. It was as close to an apology as the room was likely to get, and it was, by the measure of everyone present, enough. Augusta rose before anyone else could speak, crossed to the sideboard, and returned with the household's visiting book in both hands, the same worn leather Eleanor had closed 2 weeks ago and never reopened. She set it in front of Philip without a word. He opened it to the first blank page, took up a pen, and wrote Eleanor's name at the top in his own hand, not as companion, not as correspondent, but under the heading reserved, in every house like this one, for the mistress of it. Eleanor watched the ink dry and understood that a man who had spent his whole life protecting what he loved by refusing to name it had just done, in front of the one family capable of mocking him for it, the opposite. Augusta, standing at his shoulder, pressed a handkerchief briefly to her own eyes and declared, to no one in particular, that she had been trying to accomplish this same outcome by the wrong method for 2 years, and might have saved everyone a great deal of trouble by saying so at the start. No one at the table disagreed with her.
You've spelled it correctly, at least.
I've had 2 years of your handwriting to learn it by.
It was not, by any measure, a grand declaration. It was a duke and a woman with ink still wet on a household ledger, and a table of witnesses pretending very hard not to watch, and it was, Eleanor thought, exactly enough, better, in fact, than anything grander could have been, because it was true, and specific, and hers. Colonel Whitmore rose before the dessert was cleared, raised his glass with a hand that did not shake at all, and proposed a toast to households that remembered what mattered, looking directly at Eleanor as he said it, so that no one at the table mistook his meaning even without the particulars. Augusta drank to that with more feeling than the occasion required, and Cordelia, catching Eleanor's eye across the candles, allowed herself, for the first time all fortnight, an entirely unguarded smile. The Ashworths left 3 days later on excellent terms, though not the terms Augusta had originally laid siege for. Cordelia wrote once that autumn a short, friendly letter addressed, with evident care, to Miss Fairbourne directly, and Eleanor answered it the same week, because she had never once let a letter sit unanswered longer than she could help. Philip found her in the morning room again the next morning, early, before the house had properly woken, and set a cup of tea at her elbow without being asked, which was, for a man who had spent 2 years accepting such small services rather than offering them, no small thing.
I burned another cuff, building up the fire just now. It seems to be a habit of mine in this room.
I still have the first one, on the mantel upstairs.
I know. I looked for it once and found it missing from my own drawer, and could not decide for the longest time whether to be embarrassed or something else entirely.
She smiled. Then, in the particular unguarded way she had not permitted herself in front of him in 2 years, and did not look away from it, and neither, this time, did he.
I should like to speak to the bishop about a license. If you're agreeable. I find I have very little patience left for a long engagement, having wasted 2 years already on something that ought to have taken far less time to say.
You will need Augusta's blessing before the bishop's, your grace, and Augusta will want at least a fortnight to tell everyone in Hampshire the credit was hers.
Then we shall give her the fortnight. I find, having waited 2 years, I can manage 2 more weeks, provided you do not close any more books on me in the meantime.
I make no promises, your grace. It rather depends on what you say next.
He laughed at that, a real laugh, the sound of it unfamiliar enough in the quiet morning room that a passing housemaid stopped in the corridor to make certain she had heard it right. I knew a girl once, years ago, in a house not unlike this one, who kept every account and every kindness of a household running for a family that never once wrote her name in anything. Margaret, I want to say, though I confess after all this time I can no longer be entirely certain, and there is no ledger left to check it against. What I remember clearly is that no one thanked her as she deserved until it was almost too late, and I have wondered since how many houses are held together the same way, by someone whose name never makes it into the book. If there is someone like that in your life, the one who remembers the small things so the rest of you never have to, tell us about them below. It costs nothing to write the name down while there is still time.